Do you spend hours in your head thinking about something that happened, could have happened, or might happen? Do you ask others what to do so you don't make a mistake? Welcome to the Playing It Safe podcast. I am Dr. Z, your host. I am a clinical psychologist, an author, and a person that is super passionate about sharing with you science-based skills to overcome any type of fear-based struggles. Who doesn't experience fear? Who doesn't play it safe? In this show, we will discuss how fear-based reactions happen in day-to-day life, how playing it safe behaviors look like, sound like, and feel like, how you can put into action solid tips from behavioral science to get unstuck from worries, fears, obsessions, and anxieties, and how you can start doing what works, what matters, and what you care about. Behavioral science doesn't have to be boring. Thanks for listening, and let's get started.
I mean, a lot of what happens in a book like this is necessarily a matter of sort of intellectual insights and causing people to see things differently and to think about things differently. And I know that's not enough. Like, it's not enough for me, right? It doesn't, to embody changes like this is a whole other thing. And I don't know how far, writing can ever do that. I don't know. So, there's a whole other piece to this, a sort of a somatic piece where you sort of try to live into this way of being. And I think a book like mine can be a good starting point for that.
Yeah.
But you can't get the whole way there on the basis of cerebral insights. I think that's one of the problems of like Stoicism, right? It's all based, it's
Right.
entirely brain only stuff.
Yeah. If I can ask a little bit more about that. So I am imagining there are many day-to-day situations in which something goes off, something goes wrong. Yesterday, for example, I have to attend a boring managerial meeting. I am cranky looking at that 30 minutes when I have to talk a bunch of baloney. I was resentful because I much rather to be recording stuff. And that's life. Every single day, something may go off, may go wrong. We get interrupted. There are planned things that happen. So how do you practice gratitude in your day-to-day?
I mean, I don't know that I have a gratitude practice per se. I think what happens is I think about these things a lot and I write about them, and then I write in my journal about them. And then at another time of day, I find myself experiencing gratitude. So if you see what I mean, I think they are connected, but I've always found it quite difficult to sort of make myself feel grateful in a moment. I think there's lots of benefit, things like gratitude journals and things like that. But so yesterday, for example, I remember a very specific experience of gratitude visiting a churchyard just near where we're living now, in the sort of mid-afternoon, when the winter light around here. It is cold, but the winter light is second to none. It's amazing. It's just so beautiful. And I definitely had that feeling of just what are the chances, that you would get to participate in this little bit of reality. But it wasn't a conscious practice. And it might not have worked if it was a conscious practice. So I think it just sort of emerges. I don't know if that's a very good answer, but it's the truth, I think.
It seems a bit more organic. If I can ask a little bit more, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to unpack your experience of these processes. If your writing time gets interrupted and there is perhaps a little bit of resentment, how will you handle that? What will I see you doing on the inside?
Well, this I struggle with, right? I definitely do struggle with interruption and feeling resentful about interruption. And then one of the problems is there's lots of ways of kind of organizing your time that make it worse. Because if you sort of say to yourself, I am going to have 4 unbroken hours, then it's worse if you're interrupted. If you didn't say that to yourself in the first place, it wouldn't be so bad when you're interrupted. So this is a challenge. I think what I try to remind myself of there, well, firstly, I try to plan in a way that is my day and my week in a way that is is flexible in that way. So I don't like get up and say at 8 a.m. I will do this, and at 9:15 a.m. I will do this, and I will say, during the course of today I want to try to do 4 or 5 focused hours or something, and I'll have a rough idea of when they're going to come, but I won't be doing like, oh, it's going to start at 9:20, and then if you've been interrupted the previous minutes, it's all ruined. That's just an unhelpful way to think. And then I was very struck by a quote from C.S. Lewis that I encountered the other day in a Christian context, obviously, because that's how he was writing, but talking about how, we all live with this notion that if only we could get all these interruptions out of the way, we could get to our real life. And he's saying that, of course, the interruptions are the real life. They're the life that, in his language, that God is sending you moment to moment. That's life, right? Life is what is happening right now. And sometimes when I'm really moaning or stressed about like some difficulty in my work, my wife will remind me of something that I think she brings to her work as well, which is like, no, like this is the work, right? Dealing with the problems, this is the substance of, so it's the same point in a way, right? Interruptions are the substance of life. Problems are the substance of work. It doesn't make it okay all the time, but it's useful to remember that, this is just the stuff that you're, it's not really a distraction from life. It kind of is. It is life. That doesn't mean that, there aren't really annoying people who actually you should try to get to stop interrupting you, or, the people you shouldn't give your cell number to because they're just going to be pestered. Yeah, sure. That boundaries matter too. But I think this idea that you're going to get to a place where you're going to get to a point in your life where you don't have interruptions is a sort of fundamental misunderstanding of life.
Yeah.
Albeit a misunderstanding that I fall into.
Yeah. I think can be like a fantasy thought, right? That we're not going to be interrupted. And I love this frame that it's part of life. It's exactly what life is about in those moments. We may not like it, but it's happening. Let me be a little bit picky. So there you are. You remind yourself this is life. This interruption is life. And then how do you do with perhaps the crankiness that comes, the ruminating thoughts that sometimes may come up? How do you handle that? Because the mind has a life on its own. It's all the time going blah, 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 like a soundtrack. So if you have some thoughts like that in those moments, how would you deal with those thoughts?
On a good day, and when I am being my best self, I can hear those thoughts and not try to chase them away and let them be there and then let them fade away. And nonetheless, so I'm here writing, my 5-year-old son bursts in, he wants my attention. Some part of me thinks like, I'm really annoyed, I want to write. Another part of me is aware that like interacting with your own son is the central plank of life, right? It's not, so then I can sort of let that subside. And again, maybe I'll make my body go through the motions for a few seconds, and then gradually my mind will catch up. And then on really bad days, no, I'll just be bad tempered. So I don't think for me, again, that's something like meditation is helpful and journaling is helpful. But again, it's not something that you can do in that moment. In the moment, it seems to me, you just have to hope that you have those resources to draw on. And so you do have to do things to sort of keep the soil the mental soil in a good state. And for me, I think, morning pages, writing early morning in my journal is the crucial one of those. Meditation, I'm less disciplined about, but it is helpful when I do it. Yeah.
I think many times we have these micro choices that we have to make. It's not easy, it's not perfect ever, but it's this conscious choice that we make, right? That it's hard. It's hard many times.
Yes.
Speaking about this a little bit, in your book, The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, I think it's in the first chapter when you describe your experience of attending to this conference or webinar to get motivated. And, people are talking all things about positive thinking. I'm curious, looking back to all what you learned and you have been studying, have your thoughts about positive thinking changed? No? How do you see it these days?
I mean, that book, I think both the main books I've written have just been like me trying to figure out my sort of therapy issues at that stage in my life. And that book was, the other thing about that book was the approach that book takes is a kind of an easy way in, both for me and for the reader, to some quite difficult subject matter. So, something that I was coming up against in the challenge of writing that book is that actually quite a few of my potential readers, they already believe that those kind of motivational seminars are a bit ridiculous, right? They don't actually need me to persuade them that that you can't sort of make yourself a multimillionaire just by thinking really hard about money or something. They know that. So the challenge was to persuade them that the broader idea of trying to stamp out negativity is actually quite widespread, and that they probably do have some of that idea in their head, even though they don't believe in all that nonsense. And certainly that was clearly what I was trying in hindsight. I was trying to sort of address that in myself, right? I was already totally cynical about positive thinking in the most sort of extreme form, but I probably was engaged in trying to sort of eliminate uncertainty and fear and lots of negative emotions from my own life. So I was sort of engaged in positive thinking, even though it wasn't that kind of cliched kind. And so I think I was writing the book that I needed to read and giving advice that I needed to hear.
I think there has been a whole industry that was created around positive thinking and the idea that we shouldn't have negative thoughts. To me, the hardest part of this toxic message is that denies the complexity of being alive, that we are going to have some negative thoughts and criticizing thoughts. On that note, if you're walking on the street or you are with your kid or you're with your wife, and then you have one of those negative thoughts like, oh my gosh, I'm such a bad father. How will you relate to that thought? What will you do these days?
There are definitely days when I would just totally identify with that thought and get very gloomy and bad-tempered. That does happen. I am not perfect. But I guess on the best days, it's just to recognize one's old patterns and to have that sort of attitude of, I think it's very important to be able to have a sort of attitude of humorous indulgence, I guess, right? Like if you have some sort of relative in your family who always does some silly thing or always talks about some subject, you'd be like, oh yes, old Uncle Bill is doing that thing again. And I think you can take the same attitude to yourself, right? It's like, oh yes, guess what? And I was very struck by a line in a book by a therapist called Bruce Tift, who I quote in my book. He wrote this great book called Already Free, and he says somewhere that like you should. It's an interesting experiment to think about whatever your biggest emotional issue is, your biggest psychological struggle, and imagine never getting rid of it. Imagine having it to the end of your life, So if you have a tendency to beat yourself up internally, as an example, just to use the example you were using, maybe that's always going to be there until you die. Okay. And then I think, well, all right, maybe I'm always going to be having those thoughts about, oh, am I being a good father or being a bad father? And then you can sort of laugh about it because it's just like, nah, it's that thing again. Instead of, I've really got to change so that I don't have these thoughts anymore, which is a recipe for disaster, I think.
It is a recipe for disaster. Yeah. Within
right.
ACT,
you agree.
yeah, no, I completely agree. Like you, I'm a renegade of positive thinking, right? Within ACT, we have this process that is called diffusion. You may have heard or read about it. And we play with those thoughts. I can say I'm a bad psychologist. I'm a bad psychologist for 30 seconds in different voices.
Yeah.
Let me switch gears a little bit. I have a couple of sassy questions for sassy comments that I have, hear you making here and there. So forgive me in advance.
No, fine.
Here's one of them. What bothers you the most of pop psychology?
Bothers me the most about pop psychology? Well, I guess it's that sort of confusion between what is simple and what is easy, right? So often pop psychology makes things too complicated. It wants to build you to, especially sort of bad self-help is all about sort of complicated systems to make your life better or something. But then it also thinks that this should be easy, that if you read some instructions to do life differently, then you should just be able to sort of put them into practice. And that's ridiculous. Like, the whole challenge is the putting into practice. We all know basically what we need to do. I don't think there's much to be said about that, but we do need help in thinking about or actually doing it. So that sort of idea that, like, once you know what you need to do, the rest will follow naturally, I think that's very annoying.
Got it. What are emotions? I read a couple of, I think, months ago, a very juicy article you wrote in The Guardian. If we subtract physical sensations, what is an emotion? We have thoughts of physical sensations, right? So what are emotions?
I'm not sure I have any idea. And what I can't work out is whether that's a sort of sign of my own limitations or not. So a lot of mindfulness, Buddhist teachers, they do talk about emotions having these two components, this mental side and then the physical sensations, but then they sometimes talk about a sort of a third part, which is a kind of it translates in lots of strange ways, but like a feeling tone. That's one of the descriptions. And then of course in therapy, people are always talking as if we know what anxiety is, or as if anxiety is a thing, and I just don't know. So the question to me is, the question for me is always, is that because I've kind of seen through some kind of illusion about the way we talk about things? Or is it just because I'm really out of touch with my emotions? And maybe people who are more sensitive to their emotions than me have a much clearer sense of what it is to be sad or anxious, I have those experiences, but when I try to focus on them, they evade my attempts to focus on them. So I don't know the answer.
My next question is, what are your thoughts on work-life balance?
Oh, I really hate this phrase because firstly, because it says work and life are separate things. And I think it encourages a kind of defeatism about work. I think we should at least aspire for work to be a very fulfilling part of life, even if we live in a society where that often isn't true. And then also this idea of balance, it sounds so good. It sounds like having the right amount of each, but what it usually means, I think, is people feel a lot of pressure to be 100% excellent in both work and outside work. And I think, very often it's the appropriate thing to do in life is to pursue imbalance and to say, for the next few months, I'm going to be all in on work. For the next few months, I'm going to do as little work as I can get away with, to focus on family or whatever it might be. So,
That's much more real, right? To finding our rhythms, our season.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And here's my last question. How would you distinguish meaning from happiness?
Oh, yeah, very interesting. I think the obvious thing to say there is just that meaning is something that we know when we are experiencing or when our lives have it, and we know that it isn't necessarily associated with a positive mood, but we know that we're glad we experienced that experience or did that thing or met that person. And very often meaning and happiness totally come apart. I think, very often it can be not at all happiness inducing to be doing certain meaningful things. So they're just separate. I don't know that I can say what meaning is. You just have to trust your intuitions to know it. But a good first step is to disentangle it from happiness, and to understand that it's that sort of deep sense of rightness about something in your life that goes deeper than the mood that you have or the affect that you have when you do it.
Yeah, doing something meaningful doesn't mean that we're going to be happy and bubbly all the time. It's totally apart from that. And one last question, if it's okay. And this is a different type of question. If you were to have a chance to have a cup of coffee, tea, or a scotch or whiskey or bourbon with any person you want, who will that be today and why?
Oh, wow. Do they have to be alive, like a real person that could happen to?
It can be anyone.
Okay. Well, if it can be anyone who's ever lived, something like that, then I think I would have to go for one of the greats, like, Carl Jung, maybe. I think he would be probably I think a scotch with a cigar or something, he would probably have gone for. I don't smoke cigars, I don't smoke, but I could imagine him. And then I also always think Simone de Beauvoir would be excellent company for a coffee and alcohol in a cafe, speaking about lots of these things. It's striking to me how often I end up at her work when I'm pursuing some of the topics that I'm pursuing.
Really?
So that'd be an interesting 3-person meeting, wouldn't it? Me, Carl Jung, and Simone de Beauvoir. Well, I wouldn't be interesting, but they would be interesting. Anyway, there you go.
That would be a juicy conversation. That will be a juicy conversation.
Right.
Oliver, thank you so much for chatting with me. I am super grateful, and I hope I can bother you again in a couple of months.
Yeah, sure. Right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, I will very much appreciate it if you will subscribe and share this podcast with your friends. And if you're feeling extra generous, I welcome a review on Apple Podcasts. Show notes of this episode are in the website playingitsafe.zone. Make sure to subscribe to my newsletter so you can receive more tips to stop all types of unworkable playing it safe actions. See you soon!